You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.
Welcome back, everyone, to The Andrew Lawton Show. This story I find actually quite amusing. So Bernie Sanders did a sit-down with Anderson Cooper on 60 Minutes, and he did the whole Mussolini made the trains run on time thing with Cuba, where he said it was unfair to say that, quote, everything is bad in Cuba, unquote. And he had talked about the literacy campaign that Fidel Castro put in and other things that Cuba has done apparently so well. And he does this just so brazenly. And, you know, for a guy who is the closest thing American political class has had to a communist, at least you can admire that he's so brazen about what he wants and what he wants to implement in the United States. But Bernie Sanders sits down and says unironically that you can't say Cuba's all bad, conceded that there was an authoritarian nature there, but ultimately said that Cuba has just become such a pillar of success in so many other ways. And what was interesting is that this ended up earning Bernie Sanders not much love in the United States, but he was on the front page of the Cuban newspaper in a favorable way. I don't speak Spanish at all, but maybe it's just Granma, which is the official organ of the Central Communist Party Committee of Cuba, had very favorably written about Bernie Sanders, saying that he recognizes Cuba's contributions in education and health. Now, of course, when he is praising a communist dictatorship, the state media in that communist dictatorship is very fond of Bernie Sanders. But again, I find it very fascinating that anyone in the United States who is from Cuba, who has fled Cuba, they are just seething right now. There was actually a Miami Herald op-ed from someone who said, I went to school in Cuba under Castro. Here's what it's like, Bernie Sanders, from a Cuban national who talks about the cheap propagandist talking points that the American left peddles on Cuba and how that is so at odds with what she experienced and what actual Cubans experience, which is why they flee to the United States on Javex bottles. You don't risk your life fleeing a country when everything is as hunky-dory as Bernie Sanders thinks, or a lot of the leftist politicians in the West that insist Cuba is just this utopian paradise. But the thing that I find fascinating is that this guy's winning. This guy's winning. There was a time when this would be like the kooky Marianne Williamson of the primary, but Bernie Sanders is in the lead. The Democrats are completely unfazed and, if anything, encouraged when he talks this way about things. So I have to unpack what's going on in American politics right now. Former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele and I sat down last week when I was in Miami, actually, which has Little Havana. This is where most of the Cuban expats in America live, or at the very least, the first place they touched down in America. And my goodness, the riots that, well, the opposite of riots, actually, the celebrations in Miami when Fidel Castro died should give you an indication that the Bernie Sanders narrative of Cuba is not accurate. But I wanted to share my interview with a former Republican National Committee Chairman Michael Steele. We talked about what things are happening in the Democrat primary heading to November when the election takes place. And we also spoke about a reform initiative that is ultimately bipartisan but could help conservatives to revamp the way Americans vote in presidential elections, embracing a national popular vote. So here's my sit down with Michael Steele. I'm sitting down with the former Lieutenant Governor of Maryland, also the former Chairman of the Republican National Committee, Michael Steele. Michael, good to talk to you. Thanks for taking the time.
It's great to be with you, Andrew. Absolutely. Good to see you, man.
Let's talk first off about where we are in the course of American politics right now, because I think that it's been an eventful last 4 years, certainly. And as we look forward, a lot of people, I think, on the left are going down that same road that we saw before 2016, which is that, there's no way anyone can vote for Donald Trump again, and we have to do this. And then on the right, you have, I think, a lot of the resistance to Donald Trump from conservatives seems to have abated a bit, in my view. And I'm wondering if you'd agree with that, the people that were never Trumpers that are now, okay, well, I guess it's not that bad.
Yeah, I think on the first point with respect to how the left is approaching this election, they're turning into a clown show. Iowa is just the tip of, I think, of what will be a very dangerous iceberg for them. not just on the process size and just getting the vote out, but just generally in their understanding of where the American people are, what the American people are thinking, and how they feel about the upcoming election. There's a lot of mixed emotion about it in some quarters, and there are very strong emotions in others. There's no doubt about that. You have those who, there's no way on hell I will ever vote for Donald Trump. And then you even have those who voted for him in 2016 who have peeled off. But you still, to your second point, and it's not just among conservatives, among center-right independents, for example, who are looking at this, and they're making a different calculation and assessment, largely based on how they see the Democrats performing. So, the president, in my estimation, is in a very good position right now. He's very strong. Certainly on the economy, he's over 53% approval on the economy. I think that number is actually a little bit higher. His job approval is at 49%, 2 points higher than Barack Obama at the same point in his first term. So I think where the president is positioned, you can say, look, Mueller, impeachment, all helped because it really spoke to a narrative that the conservatives were saying that you go down this road on impeachment, you're going to bite off something you can't chew. And I think that's what's turned out, because the American people, at the end of the day, it wasn't in their mind to sort of throw out a president. So all of these factors have played into where this election is at this point. The Democrats are now going through their primary process. The president is just sitting back and enjoying the moment. And we'll see once there is a nominee, who that nominee is will matter. How they perform in the upcoming campaign will make the difference between whether or not Democrats can recapture those bricks they lost out of the blue wall in 2016, and whether or not the president is able to build on the momentum from a good economy and the other things that have happened and turn it into a victory in November.
You mentioned that who the Democrat is a relevant question here, and I was wondering if you could explain a bit more about that, because right now we see the Democrats very much eating their own, and people that in the past would have been, I think, very formidable candidates, the more moderate among them are now absolute jokes to it. It seems like the Democrat establishment.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. And so if they want to go land on Bernie Sanders, thank you very much. January 21, we'll be watching Donald Trump inaugurated as into the second term. If you want to dance with Elizabeth Warren, thank you very much. Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. If you decide to take the risk and go with someone like a Bernie Sanders a Joe Biden or Michael Bloomberg, that's a different dynamic. I've said for a while now that the nominee of the party of the Democrats should be, if they want to be competitive. It's not a guaranteed win by no stretch, but if they want to be competitive against Trump, Joe Biden is the one who, referring back to those bricks, can grab those bricks back that they lost, and that's Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania in 2016. Because he has that innate sort of Uncle Joe charisma. People know him; they're very familiar with him. Yes, he can be a little bit out there on various things, but in their mind, he's stable. And the thing that I've heard voters say to me as I've traveled around the country is, look, I'm not worried about arguing about the future of the country or the future of the Democratic Party or the future of the Republican Party. I'm looking at someone who can take me out of this spin zone, out of this crazy space that we're in right now. I want a more settled presidency that I can rely on, and I don't have to get up and spend every day and every waking hour of that day talking about what the president's tweeted or what the president says. So people are looking for some degree of normalcy, if you want to use that word, if I go with that. But it's gonna be a tall order for them. And I think they've got to figure out whether they want to be woke or if they want to win, because that's your only choice at this point. If you want to win, then you're going to identify that candidate, and I think they're easily identifiable, who can appeal to the middle of the country, who can speak to those farmers and to those blue-collar workers, to those moms who are sitting around kitchen tables trying to balance budgets with 2 weeks left in the month. And no money, right? So that's real life. And Democrats have not been very good, in my estimation, at speaking to real life. They speak to the ideal life, where, everybody's on the same page on global warming, and we've got free education, and we're gonna harangue the hell out of billionaires and grab all their cash because they don't deserve it. They never earned it anyway. It's like you hear on the debate stage when they look at Mike Bloomberg, well, there were workers that worked for you. I was like, look, dude, yes, because he employed them. You get it? He employed them.
When Obama had said, I think it was 2008, you didn't build that,
Right.
That was seen as a gaffe. But now that's standard Democrat policy, the fact that, well, you didn't do that. No.
Right. No, exactly right. So there is, in my estimation, a complete misreading of the electorate that the Democrats have been they're very expert at misreading the public. They did it with Hillary Clinton, and to some extent they did it with Obama in his second term, and that's what gave, I think, the fertile ground for a Donald Trump candidacy. In addition to the sheer incompetency of Republicans to actually put the finger on the pulse inside their own ranks to figure out exactly how much on the heels of the Tea Party movement the base had shifted, and why that base was still angry. We had, when I was national chairman, had mitigated some of that. We had, I think, a very good working relationship with Tea Party leaders around the country. We elected a lot of their candidates, constitutional conservatives, to the Congress and the state legislatures. Some have retired since then. A few have lost their seats. But their frustration grew anew after 2012, and boom, Donald Trump came in and sort of picked at that wound and launched a populist, not resurgence, but sort of energy that they were like, I can ride with that. And so now, even internally for the Republicans, looking either after 2020 or after 2024, how does that ground shift further to sort of continue the progress of electing national office holders, et cetera?
I'm actually glad you mentioned the populism, because I wanted to talk to you about the popular vote shift that we're seeing, mostly from the left. I mean, certainly the Democrats are saying they want to tear up the Electoral College. There is another way, and we're seeing this in Virginia most recently, in other states, to have popular vote that uses the Electoral College. And I find it interesting because most of the resistance, certainly that knee-jerk resistance to electing a president by national popular vote, seems to come from Republicans, because of the old narrative that, your states like New Hampshire, Iowa, Wyoming are going to be overlooked. But I think the populism aspect is very interesting, because if populism is where conservatism is headed in some form,
Short term.
yeah, that you'd think that would actually invite or welcome a popular vote.
You do, and it should, but I think what then clouds that conversation is a number of things that we've talked about, and that is ballot security, and whether or not this new approach deals with the fraud that can and has taken place in elections in the past, and not just in the past, but in the recent past. And also, I think there is, this general idea that, are we going to be electing the opposition? Well, the idea of a national popular vote is that every citizen has access to the ballot. Their vote will count. Their vote will matter. And it will be a part of making a difference. You then move away from the situation that we find ourselves in, where a candidate wins the popular vote but then loses in the Electoral College, because that is the way the current structure works. What we're looking at with national popular vote is sort of creating a level playing field where all 50 states are competitive. Why? Because guess what? Candidates now have to campaign in all 50 states, because you're building towards a national total, not just winning Wisconsin. You can win Wisconsin, that's fine, or you can lose Wisconsin, as long as you're building a number that is strong enough to be added to what you're doing in California. Here's the other thing that I think is very important, particularly for those jurisdictions in the Southwest and the West, particularly Republican jurisdictions, and that is, when you're in that space, all of a sudden now, when 8 o'clock comes on the East Coast, they're not calling the election. They can't call the election because there's still 3 hours of votes to be tabulated and counted in the western part of the country. So for those particularly Republican voters who are sitting on the 101 trying to get home or try to get to the voting polls, and at 8 o'clock on the East Coast in the past, oh yes, we call the race for. They turn around and go home. I'm not going to vote now because hell, they just called the race for the Democrat or they called the race for the Republican, and I'm done. But now. You want that vote to get to the polls because that number, no matter what it is going to add to a national number. So when you look at these elections, there's a whole new dynamic. And Donald Trump, to his credit, has said and acknowledged that if there were a national popular vote in place in 16 or 20 or in any campaign he's in, he would campaign differently. He would be campaigning in states that right now are either flyover states or the states that they ignore because they're not a competitive part of the battleground calculation.
Well, and that works both ways. I mean, states that aren't battlegrounds because you know you're going to win them, and states that aren't battlegrounds because you know you're going to lose them. So,
right.
So in the end, you've got California, New York, which are the biggest states in the union that get no real campaigning from either the Democrats or the Republicans.
Right. And so to that point, as an example, if, typically there are, I know that I'm just going to play with the numbers, so go with me here. If there are 3 million Californian independents and Republicans who vote for the Republican candidate in a typical presidential election, and you now have the opportunity where you've got 1 million people on their way to the polls at 5 o'clock to go, and now all of a sudden you've got 4 million. Now you've just added another 1 million to your national total. And if you couple that with places like New York, New Jersey, Florida, Ohio, elsewhere, all of a sudden now you can see just where you have now created margins for you to win, as opposed to, well, okay, I got 3 million votes in California, whoopee. So it for me, again, it changes the way the game is played. It is something worth looking at. And I think on the heels of the certainly in the Democratic primary in Iowa and the mess that is. I mean, first off, let's just do away with the caucus system, people. Can we just be honest and say the idea that you're going to engage in the least democratic aspect of voting, where you tell people you have to be in a location between hour 1 and hour 4, and if you're not there at hour 4 plus 1 minute, you're not there, we're going to lock you out, you can't vote. That to me is undemocratic.
And no secret ballot. It's really the only area where there's no secrecy of who you're voting for. You're literally standing in the corner.
Right. And so talk about peer pressure. And your neighbors are, oh, you standing there for Trump? Or you standing there for Biden? Or you standing there for, so it's ridiculous. Go to, a primary system. I think when I was national chairman, I advocated for a national primary. Pick a day in April, pick 4 weeks in April, and each week you have a regional primary over those 4 weeks, and you're done by the end of the month, and you know who your nominee is going to be. And so there are a lot of options and opportunities. I think the Democrats are certainly going to look at that. I think Republicans should revisit that, as we did when I was national chairman and made some recommendations on how our primary should unfold. In order to, again, the goal is to get out as many of your voters as you possibly can, to identify new voters and get them to the polls.
Do you like a popular vote because you think it would favor conservatives, or do you just think it would dampen an electoral edge that right now the Democrats have, in your view, under the status quo?
Oh, I think it favors conservatives. I think it plays to the ideal that the nation as a whole is a center-right nation, and I think that in a lot of communities, particularly when you're looking at minority communities, Hispanics and African Americans, the presumption is that's an automatic Democratic vote. I can tell you firsthand as a black man, that's not true. I can tell you firsthand as the former county chairman, state chairman in Maryland, as well as national chairman, that's not true. And we have, I believe, very fervently, still within us the capacity to make the case to a cross-section of voters that they will find appealing. And this new format allows us the opportunity, again, to go into places that we have just regressed from. Because, it's a blue state, or we're not going to win that state. Well, now you're going to play. And guess what else is essentially important here? Going back to that California example with those million extra voters who decided to continue on to the polls as opposed to turning around and going home at 5:00, that helps your down ballot. It helps your down ballot candidates as well, because now you've just added a fresh 1 million voters for governor and for the U.S. Senate and for, county commissioner and so forth. So I think for Republicans, we need to, look at it very objectively. It makes constitutional muster. It meets all the constitutional requirements. It's a compact amongst the states, no different than the lottery compacts that we're very familiar with. Certainly those in the western part of our nation who are in water compacts, know what that's like if you're sharing the Colorado River. So it's a form of cooperation among the states where they say, look, we're going to agree that this body of us that total 270 electoral votes agree that whoever wins that national popular vote, that grand national total, we agree to commit our electoral votes to that candidate. Why? Because that candidate will have competed in all of our states. That candidate will have competed in most of our communities. And I think that more than anything else is how we begin to re-engage citizens in the most important franchise they have.
Michael Steele, thank you so much for chatting. Really appreciate it.
Man, I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
You're tuned in to The Andrew Lawton Show.